purifier, life giver, cleanser of evil. Almost any religion you can Google will likely talk about water, because water is so essential to us and makes so much possible. Try living without food. You can last a long time, depending on how much food you're carrying around. Try living without water. You won't last long. Only air is more important in terms of immediate existence. Even our blood carries many of the same properties found in seawater. The Bible says, "As the deer longs for flowing streams, so my soul longs for you, O God." In our famous story today, Jesus is met by a good man, a teacher of Israel, Nicodemus. A good man from a good people. Yes, I know, our Bible doesn't usually say a lot of good things about Pharisees, because some were in conflict with Jesus and some were in conflict with the early church. But they're basically good people trying to do a good thing. And what they were trying to do is something people today try to do. They were trying to climb a ladder of purity to God. They had rules, lots of rules. How to do this, how to do that. Some were called the bruised and bleeding Pharisees, because when they saw a woman on the street, they would close their eyes lest they be tempted, and so they would bump into walls and stuff. We can be pretty sure they advocated no-touch dating. We can also be thankful that cars had not yet been invented. But despite this, Nicodemus, an accomplished man of religion, a teacher of others, comes to Jesus because he is empty. He comes to Jesus in the dead of night. Jesus had something he needed. Nicodemus was in the desert, and he wonders if this man, whom he slinks off to see in the cover of darkness, might have the answer to quench his thirst, and he's not ready for the answer. He wasn't ready to hear Jesus say, "You need to be changed, born of water and spirit, born from above." Once upon a time, I read a business book by Jim Collins. It's called Good to Great. And what Collins does in this book is he looks at businesses that have become great. And some of them are businesses like Walgreens. Businesses that not that long ago had one foot in the grave and the other one on a banana peel. But that turned things around and became thriving. Turned things around. It didn't just get better, but got great. I've spent more than a decade recommending this book to people because I learned so much from it. I base how I do ministry on some of it. But probably the most important teaching in this book is this: good is the enemy of great. Because when things are good, hey, things are good. So keep doing exactly what you're doing. Don't change a thing. Just sit back, enjoy the ride. And in business, that's often a recipe for disaster. In the church, well, that too. About 20 years ago now, some of our leadership noticed that our attendance numbers were starting to slide a little bit. And everybody was talking about that cool new church that had sprung up down the street. And we decided that, well, maybe good wasn't enough. And we started offering worship services using more than one style. There were people who said this was the wrong thing to do, and they made some good points. There were churches around us that actually scoffed and said, "What are you doing? Things are good enough. We don't need to change." But 20 years later, we're blessed. We're thriving. And we've learned to keep being really, really critical of ourselves. Our staff does not settle for good. We have learned to break things that aren't working and either throw them away or rebuild them. And yes, we're blessed. While many of our friends around us struggle. Nicodemus is confused. He is a good man, following a good God and very comfortable in his good way of doing it, but still thirsty. He knew that somehow good wasn't making him whole. And note, this is not a story about eternal salvation. I know we try to make it so. Nicodemus is not worried about going to hell. No Jew in Jesus' time was worried about that. No one in Jesus' time thought about hell the way we think about it. This is about being made whole. Nicodemus is in the spiritual desert. He's doing all the right things, following all the rules that human beings had come up with as a way to get to God. But he's thirsty. He's still thirsty. No great man of religion would go out to see someone like Jesus, a wandering preacher, if he wasn't thirsting for more. Jesus tells him he has the water he needs. Jesus says, you must be born from above, born of water and spirit. And by the way, this is not a reference to being born again in the way that so many Christians interpret it. That interpretation is extremely recent in history. That interpretation has been around less than 200 years. But it isn't just a reference to baptism either, even though it is a baptismal image, and even though John constantly references baptism. I think what we have here really is an introduction of Nicodemus to what early followers of Jesus called the way of Jesus. And being born from above means being transformed in how we live and living like Jesus lived. Feeding, healing, teaching love, breaking down the barriers between people. This was hard for Nicodemus to hear or understand. Pharisees liked those barriers. There was a lot of comfort in those, just like there's a lot of comfort in the barriers we erect. The key to transformation is living like Jesus, breaking down barriers, not trying to climb a ladder to God by following a lot of rules. This is the key to drinking the water of Christ, the water that gives full life. Every one of us at times finds ourselves thirsty. This is a story to remember in those times. It's a story to remember when we find that living in a good way that has just been good enough isn't good enough anymore and maybe is getting in the way of a great life. It's a story to remember when God seems far away, when we get complacent. It's a story to remember when we find ourselves dry and empty. Jesus calls us to do more than just believe. Jesus calls us to live like Jesus, to be transformed. Live for others. That is the path to being born from above.